Typically, when you encounter, or as I've encountered, books and literature on leadership, there's a certain expectation to come about. And that is, it has to be a military guy. It has to come from somebody who was, oh, been there, done that, Ranger Battalion, Navy SEAL, Green Beret, Delta Force, or even agency, CIA, so on and so forth. But today's guest is the author of a small book of only 100 pages titled Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. If you followed us on social media, if you've been following Redacted in that case, especially around the Christmas time, you've probably seen more than a few posts on it, because I think this is a breath of fresh air and a call to not just action, but leadership that many of us have been, in a sense, waiting for. So today, as a guest, Pastor Dr. Joe Rigney has come on as a guest. Would you introduce yourself? Because there's only so much I can do.
Yeah, sure. It is Pastor Doctor and JV football coach. Those are the big and then dad and husband and all that. I'm a pastor in Moscow, Idaho, at Christ Church here, and then I'm a professor of theology at New St. Andrews College here, that's the basics of what I do for a living. I teach theology and oversee a ministerial training program here. And then I've written a few books, including the one that we're going to talk about.
Now, I'm very excited to announce the first official sponsor of the Redacted Culture Cast. Obsidian Arms is one of those companies that reflects the many facets of gun culture. Not only are their firearms frequently found on competition fields like USPSA and 3-Gun, but they are a Minnesota-based, US-sourced original equipment manufacturer. Obsidian Arms makes their own punch and tool kits for the amateur and professional gunsmith out of Little Canada, Minnesota, that come with a lifetime warranty. Whether it is fine parts that require a Swiss machine, or you're in the design phase and are looking for an American machine shop that is in tune with the needs of gun culture, go check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Thank you, and now back to the show.
The world of theology, the world of academia in some ways, maybe this is only in my own head, kind of appears to reflect the way that special operations is treated in the world. There's kind of those who are inside it and those who are outside it. There's the view from those who are, I'm going to use a reference of Ranger Battalion, but there's kind of this description of what Ranger Battalion looks like from those who are outside. You might think of Black Hawk Down, you may think of the Tan Beret, you might think of people who are very capable at warfighting, but not understand their specific role within the larger framework of the military, nor is it easy to take the summary of experiences and challenges that go on inside the unit and communicate them outside, and perhaps sometimes it's not right to. How is there a parallel to where you're at with when it comes to academia as well as the study of theology?
Yeah, so I think there's probably some parallel there in terms of the way that a theology faculty operates and the kinds of tensions. But I think there's probably a lot of overlap with various other kinds of institutions. I think one of the things actually that the book is predicated upon is the notion that sort of people are people wherever you go. Institutions operate in similar kinds of ways, and that whatever the differences are in the particulars, there are common challenges, problems, and dynamics that show up in a home, in a church setting, in a school setting, in a military setting. I'm not in the military, never been in the military, but you're not the only military guy who's read the book and felt like, oh, there's some stuff here for us. And so it's that kind of, so I think that there's commonalities that translate just because humans are humans and groups are groups. And therefore the sorts of dysfunctions that work their way in have a common DNA.
Okay, so then you describe in the earlier chapters, you use the word a crisis of degree,
yeah,
as sort of as building the explanation of what you think is out of order, and that doesn't come. I guess I can be not even frank about it, but there's plenty of people out there trying to say why the world or how the world is messed up or how the world is wrong or whatever the thing is, and this one is unique to me, and I'm going to use this as an example because I've read a number of books, whether it's All right, I've read another books that one might want to say are similar, or at least on the same category, and that would be not the same category, but that would be like a Man of Steel and Velvet, or Royal Manhood, or Point Man by Farrar, or the Wild at Heart. And oftentimes these books begin with some sort of description of the world being out of order, in the sense of you're under attack. This is coming from having a background in military. It's very much so instigating war imagery as a sense of urgency. But you go a different route. You talked about a crisis of degree. What is? Can you describe that for the audience?
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting because of the origin of it. So that phrase, the phrase comes from a French literary critic named René Girard. That's not important. He got it from Shakespeare. And so I teach theology and literature. Shakespeare's one of the guys I teach. And Shakespeare's a very shrewd observer of human nature. And part of why his plays have endured has been because he got how people work. And when it came to kind of describing a crisis of degree, which is essentially a breakdown of social order, the actual, one of the key, he did it in a number of different plays, but the one that I chose to draw it out, where he actually doesn't just show it, but also describes it, was actually a military context. So it's his telling of the Trojan War between the Greeks and the Trojans, and the Greeks have been, assaulting the city for, half a decade, and have not gotten anywhere. And the Greek generals are standing around trying to figure out, like, what's the problem? Why have we not been able to sort of overcome this city? And the initial proposals from a couple of the generals are basically, well, the gods test us through trial. They try to separate the men from the boys. Everybody, looks good when you're standing on the beach, but it's when the storm comes that you actually find out where the real men are. And so the reason that we've not been able is the gods are testing us and trying us to see if we'll overcome. And there's and so you can kind of hear that, like, there's these external challenges, and are we going to man up? And there's something to that. But one of the generals, Ulysses, actually says, I've got a different take. And he finds the defect in the Greeks themselves. It's actually an internal problem having to do with the breakdown of the social order within the Greek camp, which he describes in terms of degree. So degree is the principle of social order. It's what allows things that are unlike to be united together in a common enterprise without breaking apart. So husband, wife, parent, child, pastor, parishioner, employer, employee, all of these sort of relationships of difference have a kind of union that he puts under the name degree. That's just Shakespeare's term for it. But also shows up as military. Actually, is a really good illustration of it. It's how you channel ambition and energy in a productive rather than a destructive way. So a guy comes into the military and he may start out as a private or whatever, but he can work his way up the ranks by sort of excelling in his work. And so what you're doing is you're channeling what otherwise would be destructive rivalry and envy into a way of advancement that doesn't just advance the individual, but advances the unit as a whole. And Ulysses' point is that's broken down here because the general is disdained by the one beneath him, and then the guy beneath that is disdained, and it sort of trickles down, and everything falls apart because the center's not holding. And he attributes this to a kind of weakness, abdication, and loss of degree as embodied in the leaders. It's the failure of the leaders that has led to this kind of like breakdown of the entire army. And as he describes it, he's applying it to this army, but he's treating it like this is a universal human thing. A family would break down in the same way. A church would break down in the same way. A nation might break down in the same way, when basically the leaders function the way that a planet functions in relation to its moons. It works by gravity. Gravity is this invisible force that causes things to like orbit properly. And when degree goes wrong, the planets wander into disorder, they collide with one another, and everything kind of goes belly up. And he's like, therefore, you need to have leaders with gravity and in order to have a functioning military or a functioning society. And so then I take that and I say, look, that's what we live in. We live in this crisis of degree. I draw from another leadership book actually written in the 90s by a rabbi named Edwin Friedman called A Failure of Nerve, where he says we live in a society marked by reactivity, kind of like these anxiety, angsty, powder keg, like everybody's on edge and nobody knows what the problem is, but it could go off at any minute. A herding instinct where everybody runs left and it just stampedes left and right. Blame shifting where nobody takes responsibility for themselves and for their emotions and for whatever they're doing, but everybody's blaming everyone else. All of which kind of coalesces to sabotage the most mature leaders in a community. So if you try to lead well, those dynamics lead to sabotage and a derailment. And then leaders eventually they buckle, they have a failure of nerve, and the thing falls apart. So those are sort of the two diagnostic tools, the Shakespearean crisis of degree, and then this age of anxiety, institutions of anxiety, angst, and turmoil that blame shift, make excuses, and sabotage the mature. That's the kind of setup. And then I'm saying that's the problem. I want to propose a way to deal with it through leadership.
So the difference that I took from the crisis of degree, especially that you were drawing on Ulysses' criticism of the Greek generals in this story of a story, is it's in its own right. It also it stands out because there's no shortage of the criticism of leadership right now. There's no shortage of it, I don't think. Now maybe my echo chamber is a little small, but you could look to politics, business, or even let's go social media. Frequently, and this is again might be just the algorithm, but what I'm encountering is this plea and call for there to be strong men within the church. Now, this also comes at a time where so many characters, whether it's Sean Ryan, perhaps Joe Rogan, or these very public, often are very masculine characters, are also coming to faith. And so the call for Christian masculinity isn't new, but your challenge is quite different, because instead of appealing in the beginning to something like feminism or some external problem, right, you're saying that the crisis of degree comes from the leaders abdicating their responsibility. And I found that rather not profound, but rather like different.
Yeah.
Not different just because it's unique, but like there's all this attention outwards. What about inwards? And so
right. That's 100% right. And it's easy to see the various external kinds of threats, whether they're ideological or whatnot, as kind of the key thing. But all of those external challenges, their potency actually comes from defects on the inside.
Can you like directly parallel it to like the whipping boy of the right now, which is the woke, whatever, with the woke thing, like, sure, because it's easy to blame the woke, but that doesn't make a solution.
Yeah. So the heart, like I'll put it this way, the heart of what woke runs on is untethered empathy. Like the common thread through all forms of woke, whether it's the feminist, the queer, the racial, is some notion of the victimhood oppression matrix that kind of weaseled its way into all institutions of society, ran on this notion of untethered empathy, meaning compassion that was not tethered to what's good and right and true for that individual and for the group, but instead was a kind of fundamental adaptation of all of society to the most reactive, immature, and dysfunctional members. So and that is not fundamentally about the victim, real or alleged, it doesn't matter. That is about a certain kind of abdication of the leaders who are setting the tone. It's allowing the agenda to be set by the most reactive and immature through accommodation, and empathy is the thing that kind of did it. So one of the things I learned from Friedman is he calls it the fallacy of empathy. I've got another book coming out next month called The Sin of Empathy, which is it's an expansion on this element of the problem that basically argues compassion, which is a great and good, it's a natural human virtue and it's a Christian virtue. This is a really great thing, but like all great things, when it goes wrong, it goes really, really wrong. And when it becomes untethered, ungoverned, it becomes a kind of channeling agent for passions. And so people get drunk on everybody else's passions. So that's where you get the herding thing, where one person feels something and everybody joins them in that feeling. and the feelings become the driver. And if you do that, you're not going to have an intentional, directional agenda. Like you're not going in a particular direction. You're now going to be derailed, sabotaged, left or right by this. And so, perhaps the way to put a point on it is, there's this Shakespeare piece, there's this Friedman piece, but like the biblical piece is just what went wrong in the garden. Where did it go wrong? And it wasn't that Adam and Eve just ate the fruit. Like that was like the big sin, but how did they get there? And it was like Adam's passivity in the face of a temptation. Here you have, as the story goes, the serpent is tempting his wife. He's supposed to be a guardian. He's supposed to guard the sacred space of the garden. And rather than hearing this blasphemer, assault his wife and blaspheme God, he just stands there and lets it happen. So the abdication comes first, and then what does he do? Well, then he listens to the voice of his wife who says, hey, why don't we disobey God? And he values her over the word of his God. And then when it's time to, when he gets called to account, when God shows up and says, what did you do? He says, the woman that you gave me. He points the finger at her, and then the head blames the body. And so that sequence of an abdication, which leads to a great failure, which is followed by blame shifting and excuse making, that's the problem. And at every step, it's a failure to take responsibility for oneself, which then enables you to sort of pass the buck. And that's the kind of endemic societal problem that we're facing. And the antidote to that is leaders, particularly men, who take responsibility for themselves, who are grounded in who God is, and therefore have a kind of stability and steadfastness in the face of the various ways that they'll be sabotaged.
Okay, so I'm going to again use a bit of a military reference, but it's also going to be in time. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 some odd years have undergone no shortage of criticism. But one key repeating element, whether it's from the right or from the left, whether it's from people in the military or outside, is not simply some sort of trite idea like, oh, it's just war for oil, but what was the point? What was the objective? Or maybe more specifically, that there was a failure on behalf of the leadership to clearly define what the objective is. I think it's on page 28. It's like, this book isn't terribly long, but it's on page 28 where you say the role of the leader is to determine what is and is not the mission. Correct. Can you expand on that subject a little bit more?
Absolutely. So, the scriptures regularly, and not just the scriptures, ancient literature is filled with this stuff too, regularly use the example of a body as a way of describing social groups. So you have a whole body, and then there's a head. And so you have to think carefully about what's the relationship between the head and the body. So in a marriage, that's a husband and a wife. He's the head, she's the body. And the kids would be part of the body as well. In a military group, you've got a general, or if it's a smaller unit, you might have a sergeant or somebody. But there's a head, and what's his main role? Well, it's not mainly barking orders. It's not fundamentally that dimension. Now that happens in various groups to various degrees, but there's something more fundamental. The head's responsibility is to know what the purpose of the body is. Like, what is this thing for? And to keep that purpose in mind at every step along the way. It's mission clarity is the way to talk about that. And then know the purpose of the body, to guard and protect the body. Like, he's fundamentally responsible for kind of setting the perimeter and guarding it. And then empowering the members of the body to fulfill their function. So what's their job? His job isn't to do what they do, but his job is to make sure that they have what they need to do what they do, so that the whole body works for its purpose. And so if the head gets derailed and doesn't wake up in the morning knowing what you're doing, then nobody else will, and it will just be tossed to and fro. It'll be an immature entity. The Bible describes children are those who are tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine or every passion or every desire. Children get tossed, and institutions get tossed when the leaders are not mature. And so that idea of mission clarity in your home, in a church, in a military unit, in a business, in a school, that's a common thread that runs. And it's when institutions forget what they're for that they get hijacked.
Okay, so I think you go into answering a little bit further in the book, but there's a fundamental question that comes up on this subject. You're describing the role of the leader is to define the mission.
Yeah.
The role of the leader, his primary responsibility is to well, not primary, but maybe is his initial
Yeah.
responsibility in an order of business is to say this is the mission.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do I put this in any other way? Is a lack of mission from the leader an immoral thing, or is it simply an incapability thing? Like, what happens when you have a leader? I'm thinking of this on two frames, from two perspectives. One, if I'm in an organization and the leader doesn't know where to go, is that considered a failure in the quote unquote skill of leadership? Or if I'm looking at myself and I am, say, the head of my household, waking up in the morning and not having a clear direction, is there a moral responsibility there that's not being fulfilled or
Yes,
being perhaps avoided?
It would be both. So I think that on the one hand, it could be an ineptitude. You kind of run into something like the Peter principle, where a guy gets promoted above his capacities, and all of a sudden he's deer in headlights, and it's obvious to everyone. And that's that. Who's responsible for that? Well, who put him there? Okay, and so it may not be quite the same sort of moral culpability for him. It's who gave him that job that was above his capacities. When it comes to things like but the moral dimension would be the biblical teaching is a husband is the head of his home. I say this all the time because I think sometimes people get confused about this biblically, where people go, well, the Bible teaches a husband ought to be the head of his home, and it's like it absolutely does not. The Bible teaches that the husband is the head of the home, whether he wants to be or not.
Okay.
That, like, in other words, the headship of a husband in his home is a given. The question is whether he will be a faithful or an unfaithful one. And he could be an unfaithful one in a number of different ways. He could be a tyrant. He could be a jerk. He could be lazy. He could abdicate. He could be passive. He could, abdicate his role. All of those would be failures, and they would be morally culpable. It would be the sort of thing that if God were to show up at your house and say, hey, what's going on here? That he would say, he's coming to talk to you because you're the one who's responsible for the whole. That doesn't mean you're to blame for everything that happens in your home, for example, or in another institution, it might be not everything that goes on in there is your fault in a blame sense. But are you responsible for everything that happens under your care? And the answer is you are. That's what headship means, is a kind of oversight and responsibility. And so bad things may show up. Whose responsibility is it to deal with it? You have your kids are sinning. Whose responsibility is that? It's yours. You can't pass the buck. You can't say, well, the kids, you know how people are. God's going to say, yeah, I do know how people are. That's why you're there. Your job is to address this. That's what responsibility means. But there is a moral dimension to that responsibility.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification, because I think it very oftentimes comes across as, well, I should be in charge of my family, but I'm not. And yet at the same time,
exactly.
So you're arguing very clearly, no, you are responsible for your family. Whether or not you're abdicating that responsibility is the question.
It's not there's no it's not like it's a flip a coin thing where, hey, we could just decide that actually now my wife is now at the head of the home. She can't be. It's like gravity. It doesn't work that way. You could try to make it work that way, but it would just be a different form of abdication.
Okay, so I have to tie in one more element of maybe the gun culture a little bit larger, but there is every once in a while a scandal comes out. There's some sort of scandal that breaks out, or if one commonality that I think Nathan Spearing has illustrated the opposite of, and I think you have met him. He's out of North Carolina. But let me put it very shortly. The failure rate of marriages in special operations is extremely high. We're talking numbers that could range between 60 and 70%, 70 or even higher. However, I want to be clear that the trope of a person on their 8th marriage or their 3rd marriage kind of skews the numbers.
Right.
And so you have this, but what I'm bringing up in this illustration is there are people in, say, the firearms industry or the gun culture that have been perceived as sort of role models, men of good character. This is also on the heels of or maybe at the front of the wave of this, let's call it revival within the firearms world, the gun culture, the military, the special operations, this kind of masculine sphere. It's not purely, but let's go. And yet when somebody is, say, on paper, an excellent leader, and on in demonstration, they've led men into battle, they've gone to war, they've done the thing, they've created the business, but their home life is a wreck.
Mhm.
You illustrated in the book that leadership begins in the home and then it flows out from there. Is that correct, or am I mistaking it?
Absolutely right.
Okay. Now, I wanted to expand on that a little bit, or I was hoping that you could expand a little bit on refining that, or not refining, on that illustration. Again, I'm going to use a stereotype as you have the guy who's very accomplished, business, military, whatever. And yet when you kind of pull back the veil of his public persona, and I'm not talking about having a fake persona for the public, but when you get to know their personal life, they're estranged from their wife, or they're going through a divorce. I'll even use another reference. There seems to be a pattern amongst people, even in quote unquote the masculine arena, that after about 3 to 4 years of public image, you find out that their marriage just collapsed.
Right.
So
yeah. This and I'll bring it over into the arena that I work in terms of pastoral ministry. That's a thing that happens there too, right? The pastor's kid is a notorious stereotype for a reason, meaning it's the kid who grows up going to church all the time because dad's the pastor, but then when he gets out on his own, apostatizes, falls away from the faith, or becomes a total wreck, or the marriage falls apart. And the common thread in a lot of these things is, here's a guy who has it's like the sort of guy who is going to start working out, but he decides he's only going to work out his right bicep. He never does reps on the left side. And so that sort of guy, if you then were to do certain kinds of exercises, might excel because of the skill that he's developed with one muscle. And yet, if you were to look at the whole, you would go like, there's a serious deficiency. And so a guy who excels at leading other men, and typically other men like him, whether that's in a ministry context or in a military context or a business context, he has a certain skill set that he's developed to be able to inspire and lead them, and then is an absolutely inept when it comes to caring for and leading a wife, or caring for and leading his children. Okay. And over time, what will happen is, this is a natural human thing, but it's a bad human thing. We tend to we gravitate toward the places that we're good at. So when that starts to develop, rather than lean into the weakness and figure out, okay, I need to figure out what does it mean to be a husband and a father, and to put the effort into learning what it means to take responsibility there, I'm going to go where I'm already, where I already excel, or I'm already growing and I'm getting all kinds of accolades. And then that just exacerbates the problem. So you throw yourself in a ministry context, it's the pastor who works 50 hours a week and 80 hours a week and is just pouring himself out for his flock. And they all love him because he's preaching and teaching and excelling in the things that he's devoting effort to, while his family languishes. And this is why, the reason I drew this attention to this is the Bible treats the family as the first congregation and is the qualification for a man for ministry. So the Bible says, if you can't manage your own household well, what makes you think you could manage the household of God? Why would you think if you can't do the little one, why would you think you could do the big one? And I think that's a biblical requirement when it comes to ministry, because of the nature of the ministry. But I think it's a good rule of thumb in any kind of institution. Long-term health depends upon men who have the ability to do all of that. And so there may be, this is why you see flash in the pan, a guy who's really good, but then flames out. Why? Well, because there wasn't, he got promoted too quickly, and he neglected certain elements of what it means to be a faithful man, in favor of working out just the right bicep.
Okay, so that your your description, your requirement of the family, it's not yours. I'm just using you as the placeholder for this. It would make a lot of sense within the context of the church. Like you can very clearly see, oh, hey, the worship pastor's child is a floozy or something. I don't pick a word that's they're going through a divorce. It's time for them to take a break from or they're not going through. Doesn't matter. Pick an example. But like, if the leader of your youth group ministry is not his family life is not in order, it's a very reasonable thing. It also would be, I think, a little bit more culturally accepted. But if you were to go to, like, say, a general and fire him, so to speak, because his family life is not in order, it's not as actually the more I think about it, the less unusual that is, even though it happens. And so, like, for example, unless there's a public scandal where a person of leadership is, say, in adulterous relationships with multiple women, and it becomes a public scandal, then he'll be removed. But as long as it's not public, then everyone will turn a blind eye.
Correct.
Now, in your argument, you're saying, not even your argument, and so you're saying from even a biblical perspective, the individual's first responsibility is their home, and then if they can't do that, then any form of leadership is outside of their reach, or is there no room for grace here?
No, there would be room for grace, but it would be order. It would be, I would say, if I had a guy, if I was pastoring a guy in the military who was excelling as a colonel or something and was well respected, but his marriage is falling apart, my counsel to him would be, hey, you're a husband and a father before you're a colonel. In terms of the order of your responsibilities before God, this is more important than that. And so it doesn't necessarily mean you should resign your commission right now. What it means is, in terms of your priority and your energy, are you working on your marriage? Are you like, and it's the same sort of thing. Like, if you put it in any other context, it would actually make sense. Like, if you had a colonel who was really bad at one aspect of his job, part of his job review would be, hey, you're not really good at this piece. We need you to go get some extra training. We need you to go take a class. We need you to whatever. We need you to go through some stuff in order to shore up this deficiency. And it's like, what I'm saying is, you ought to, and a guy who really wanted to do well would rise to that and say, I'm going to take responsibility for this weakness and I'm going to work on it. And I'm saying the same thing ought to apply in spades when you're talking about the care of immortal souls, which is what you have in your home. Like, you're a husband and a father, you ought to devote the same thing. And typically men, like, it's a common temptation to want to, sort of move away from the things we're not good at because we're not good at them. And a guy can feel like leading the men in the military makes sense to me. They're like me. When I say this, I know what they hear. And when they do that, I know what's going on. It all makes sense. And so it's like, I want to lean in and do the thing I'm good at. Yeah. When I say something to my wife, she takes it in a way and I'm going, well, I don't even know how you got there. And when she says something to me, I don't know where it's coming from, or my kids are a mystery. And I'm saying, yeah, that's a problem. This is why the Bible tells us, live with your wife. It has to tell husbands, live with your wife in an understanding way. You have to. There's a labor to figure out, how does the world look from a woman's perspective? Now, that needs to be tethered to what God says. It's not just she gets a blank check. That would be the untethered empathy thing. Well, whatever she says goes, and that's just another form of abdication. But there is an effort to be made to say, like, what does life look like for my wife and my kids? And I need to budget for that in my actions. And, fundamentally, one of my first pieces of advice on this, I do this regularly as I think about my own family, is in the book of Job. One of the way Job's described as a great man, one of the greatest men of his day. He's got a wife and 10 kids, and it describes him as a faithful and righteous and blameless man. One of the examples it gives of his blamelessness is that when his kids, they're grown, when they're having a party, it says that he would rise early and offer sacrifices on their behalf, lest they had sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And I look at that and I go, what's Job doing? He says, yeah, they're my kids. Yeah, they're grown. Yeah, they're responsible for themselves at some level, but they're my kids. And I'm going to go before the Lord on their behalf and say, this is mine. And their sin is a reflection of me. And so I need to take it seriously and ask for God's help in order to lead it. And I think that's what a husband ought to be doing. I do this to say, Lord, there's an issue, like, my kids are fighting, or there's an issue in my home. Lord, I just need you to know this is my problem. No one else is coming. No one else is going to fix this. No one else can fix this. This is mine. Now, that doesn't mean you can always fix it. Sometimes, like, women sin. Women initiate like 70% of divorces. So I don't want to beat up the guys and say that every time, you're talking about the divorce culture or the marriages that break up. I don't want to say that it's always the man's fault, as though it's always necessarily a failure on his part. She's a sinner, and she might have unrealistic expectations, or she just might decide, I want out. And so you're budgeting for all of that. But the key issue is he taking responsibility for what is his? Well, as the head, the family is his. That's who God entrusted it to, and he needs to own it.
All right, so I'm going to pivot a little bit because we're a little short on time, and there's two major subjects that I really did want to address as we're kind of moving our way out, and they both are related to sabotage.
Okay.
So in the end of the book, you start drawing a distinction between the way that Jesus and Paul treat the Pharisees, or as I think you called them, the apostles of the world, and then another group that's referred to as the refugees. Now, this sounds very starkly similar to the ideas of rules of engagement, combatants and non-combatants.
Right.
If I am quote unquote operating in a theater, which is just such a military term, but if you're in an environment that involves the potential of violence, which again is basically everywhere now, but beyond the pale, one of your responsibilities is to distinguish between who can and cannot be engaged with force.
Correct.
So, but it doesn't. But one place that I've struggled with in that is it sort of, from a philosophical understanding, is an island floating in the air. Like, we have to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Why?
Yeah.
But you started to, in this illustration, establish a foundation for it. But you're using an example. Do you have a moral foundation for the distinction between combatants and non-combatants in this environment, or in the phrasing of the book, apostles of the world and refugees? And could you?
Yeah. So basically, what I'm trying to do there, the method that I'm going about is I'm saying Jesus modeled something for us. It's very clear that he spoke one way to one group of people and a different way to a different group of people. Paul did the same thing. Certain people, Jesus basically rhetorically punched in the face, called them names. You whitewashed tombs, you brood of vipers, you hypocrites. And he just unloads every rhetorical barrel he has at a certain group. And then a different group, all of these people are sinners. So it's not like one group is sinful and one group is not. But this other group, he's much more long-suffering, kind. It's a gentleness. Woman, who condemns you? No one condemns you, then go and sin no more. It's a very different kind of approach. It's more of a peacemaking kind of initially. And so I'm looking at that going, okay, so Jesus is the model here. As the God-man, he's perfect. And he's speaking differently to different groups. I need to then think about what the difference is between these two groups. And so as I break that down, and when it comes to, this is kind of a culture war context, and you could probably then think about how you bring this over into a full military one. But apostles of the world are leaders. These are the Pharisees are putting themselves forward. The Sadducees are putting themselves forward as cultural leaders. They have a message, and they're aggressively seeking to spread it. So I'm a pastor, and I'm thinking, here's a person, I'm evaluating, is this person a leader? Do they have influence? Do they, formal or informal, do they have influence? Are they a thought leader, a cultural gatekeeper type person? Do they have a message, and is it counter to the truth? Is it a false message? Are they aggressively seeking to spread it? And then are they high-handed in their rebellion against God? In other words, the message is the sort of thing that, having been attempted correction, they dig in. that sort of person, self-righteous, leading, Jesus just unloads. He's going to be as hard on them as their hearts. And on the other hand, you have someone who maybe has believed the lies that they've been fed, isn't a leader, and with that sort of person, Jesus is going to invite them. It's more of an invitation. He treats them like they're collateral damage in a war. And yet at the same time, I don't want to pretend like this is super easy. There's a great illustration of this is Jesus unloads on the leaders of the temple. This temple is it's a den of thieves. You guys are wicked. You've turned God's house into a den of thieves. And yet then commends this poor little widow who puts 2 pennies in the offering box at that den of thieves. So, and you can imagine he slams the temple and maybe she takes offense. Like that would be on the table, right? She's going, what are you attacking my church for? And he's going to have to at that point go, well, I'm attacking the leadership of your church. I know that you're pious. I know that you're trying to do what you know is best. And so he would treat her differently than he would treat the guys, the wolves. And so I want to distinguish, maybe that's another distinction, biblical one, would be there's a difference between a wolf and their prey, a confused sheep who's convinced that this wolf in sheep's clothing is a sheep, right? Oh, no,
Yeah.
it's a sheep. And I'm going, no, it's a wolf. And so I'm going to shoot the wolf and I'm going to treat the sheep differently.
Okay.
And that's the kind of breakdown I have in mind as a pastor that I think would roughly track in a similar way to, in a military context. Why would you want to, the leaders of terrorist cells or terrorists themselves in an insurgency context would be different from the population who may be sympathetic to them, but you're not just going to treat the population as a whole like you would treat the leaders.
Yeah, and that is that in a just war theory, war making concept. Correct. That is a trouble and a challenge of our day and age. Is third party actors that are affiliated but not that are supported and weaponized or mobilized by someone that they're not necessarily ideologically aligned with. But I kind of want to step away from the military side of it and go straight into the sabotage side of it, which is what you're writing to. And I think, and what I'm hoping, what I got from the book is something a layer deeper than strategy. Okay. So if you think of it as you've got tactics, techniques, and you keep kind of going from the surface level down to the root at the core, what drives our lives is not the means of living, food and water, but a will to survive and a purpose or some direction. I think I'm kind of adding a little too quickly, but the point that you were illustrating and I wanted to kind of double down in was how, I think what page was it on? 79. And you're talking about how, but I'm going to use chapter or page 79. But even here, there's a danger lurking. It's tempting to separate from fellow Christians in order to appease or integrate or ingratiate ourselves with unbelievers. We might call this the danger of winsomeness. Winsomeness at its best is seeking to remove unnecessary obstacles to the gospel. Now, immediately, one might think of like contemporary Christian aesthetics, right? Oh, we want it to be welcoming. We want it to be inviting. As we delve a little bit deeper, and I think the criticism still stands that those things, that kind of church oftentimes comes short as very shallow. Quite frankly, like the men who are desiring faith then can't find it there.
Right.
But this isn't to just be an attack on churches or people. But what you're illustrating, and the point that I'm trying to get at, is kind of this idea of infinite grace, where I like, and I want to see if you draw a distinction between piousness and something else. Because let me put it this way: when you were talking about empathy as even the sin of empathy, what I'm thinking of is this sort of like, oh, that person. A person is doing something evil. Let's use the homelessness problem in an area, or let's talk about criminality in various states, or even our own culture. And what you have is you have someone who does something evil repeatedly, but they're given permission to do so perpetually because of everybody's abdication to treat it as evil.
Correct.
And then also, there's a secondary explanation that's given that's something like, oh, it's his socioeconomic status. Mm-hmm. How do you approach that from a leadership, like what's wrong with that direction, this infinite grace? Like, this person can repeatedly abuse me and create some sort of Stockholm syndrome, or how do you respond to that?
Yeah, good. So infinite grace is a real thing. God has endless grace for an endless number of sinners, but that grace is powerful and isn't simply indulgence. And so typically, what this is a good example of. Here's a great and good thing that God has: grace for sinners, that then gets distorted into a kind of indulgence of sinners, meaning your sin's not a big deal, and we're going to continue to allow you to do it. So I think a fully Christian society would encounter a rapist, preach the gospel to him. If he were to repent of his sins, would assure him that he would go to heaven and still execute him. Like, does that make sense? Like, in other words, the earthly justice for his crime wouldn't be overthrown by the extension of grace and the promise that God would forgive him and welcome him into the heavenly kingdom. This is precisely what Jesus does with the insurrectionists next to him on the cross. Those guys, we say they're thieves. They're actually probably insurrectionists. That's what that word meant. And so here you have an insurrectionist, and Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. And it's still probably just that the guy got executed for his rebellion.
Can you very briefly describe what you mean by insurrectionist in a cultural context? Because in our day and age, it's probably just going to go straight to politics and garbage.
Yeah, sure. He was probably the sort of guy who, in the first century, you had a number of groups among the Jews who didn't like the fact that the Romans ruled over them and would attempt to overthrow the Roman occupation or assassinate collaborators, the Jews who were working with the Romans, and would try to lead it. So the Bible talks about this. And Paul gets confused as one of these. Jesus is executed as one of these. They think of them like the reason is he's trying to lead a rebellion against the Roman authorities. And so that's probably what that guy was, because petty theft would not have gotten you executed in Rome. Like that's right. So what's he getting executed for? And it's like, it's probably that he was involved in some sort of insurrection against the Roman authorities. That's why he's on the cross. That's what those guys were. Back to the thing on the indulgence is basically a misplaced empathy. So what we end up doing is in those situations you were describing, we focus on, here's the criminal who's done the evil thing, and now we're going to make excuses on their behalf. Well, it's because they had a rough home life, and it's because they, came from a lower class, or it's because they had poverty, and that's the reason they did these bad things, and therefore we're going to excuse the bad things. And what I want to say is the explanation never is an excuse. You don't get to say, hey, bad things happen to me, and therefore the bad things I'm doing are okay. Instead, it's understand it, and you may want to try to go address root causes at some level. But the fundamental thing is, are you calling people to take responsibility for themselves? Do they and you begin with yourself. I'm taking responsibility for me, and therefore I expect you to take responsibility for you. That's the call. And what we do is we refuse to do that in the case of various protected groups. This is what woke did, is it kind of carved out and said, if you can put yourself in this victim class, everything you do is justified. One of the examples I've used on this is like the end result of that kind of logic is what happened in Israel with the October 7th attack a few years ago. And in the aftermath, I think it was a spokesman for Hamas says, we're victims. Everything we do is justified.
Yes.
So the rape and murder of children is justified because we're the real victims. And why did they appeal that way? Because the West is shot through. That's the rules we've set up. That's why. And so when you have a man who is deranged and thinks he's a woman and therefore wants to shower with the girls in the girls' locker room, and the society says we need to accommodate that. We need to build, like everybody else has to adapt to his deranged fantasies. We think we're doing it out of compassion, but we're not. There's no compassion for those poor girls. Those poor girls are totally what goes wrong with the empathy is that it becomes myopic, and we fixate on one victim could be in scare quotes here. The suffering of this person, the trans dude who wants to shower with the girls,
sure.
His feelings become the be all end all, and everybody else we're blind to. And what the way to counteract that is by having sober mindedness, which tethers your compassion to what is true and what is good. And if it's true and good, then it needs to be true and good, not just for that guy, but for everybody else in the situation. Like everybody needs to be the object of that kind of compassion, not just this myopic focus on him.
And I imagine if we had the time, we could extrapolate that same sort of attitude. The danger of victimhood is that it becomes infinite justification for whatever activities you want to do, which is where, from my let's call it perspective, is not even the right way. All the people that I've seen who all the encounters that I've had with people in a violent capacity have been a battle of determining where they're at. And where they're at mentally and morally, because there's an appropriateness to it, and that's kind of an odd way to describe it, other than violence has an appropriateness scale that's very hard to describe, but when we see it, we understand it. Like when a 12-year-old child punches you in the chest, you don't nuke his house,
right? Kind
of thing, right? Now this is, some of it is more overt, some of it is a little bit more not endemic, some of it's a little bit more pale. But what we've seen from, say, communist countries that all claim victimhood and then go and commit
great atrocities
to the numbers of deaths that the human mind cannot comprehend, even in observation. Hundreds of millions of people dead, or tens of millions of people dead, is more than I think most of us can really comprehend in scale.
You could do the math, but you can't actually imagine it.
Exactly. So I wish I had more time with you, because I would like to get back into sabotage and what that looks like, but I think we should wrap it up today.
Yeah, happy to come back.
With that being, thank you. So with that being the case, what is your closing statements on being aware of sabotage and how to work your way, not necessarily out of it, but that, and then more kind of finally, who are you, where do we find your book, and how does this go forward?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with that one, and then I'll give you my closing kind of comment. So Joe_Rigney, that's me on Twitter, X, or whatever we call it now. If you want to get the book, emotionalsabotage.com is where you can get it. The new one's coming out in a month, and it's called Sin of Empathy, and it really is just more of a deep dive on the way that compassion becomes a tool of manipulation in the modern world. So those would be a couple of places you can go chase those down. In terms of like the most practical, actionable thing I think I could say would be leaders especially, but all human beings, but leaders especially, need to learn to pay attention to their passions. Like they need to learn a self-awareness about your hesitations, reluctances, impulses, the thing, when your dander gets up and you start to feel your temper rise, learning to be the sort of person who is aware in the early stages of, I just self-censored myself. Why did I do that? Well, there's some fear. What was I afraid of? Why wouldn't I say the thing that I thought was true? Well, because I knew it would upset that person. Or when I start to feel myself growing in frustration because a subordinate or my wife or my kids have said something to me. Growing in the capacity to be aware of when your passions begin to get into gear. And then that's step one, is a self-awareness. And then what to do about it. How do you, as a man, come to govern your passions? And as a Christian, I'm going to say it's not going to be possible in any kind of long-term, enduring, or faithful way apart from the gospel of Christ. Your sins need to be forgiven, and you need to know that God is for you and not against you. That's going to be an anchor that enables you to govern your passions and become what I commend in the book as a sober-minded leader. Someone who has a clarity of mind, they know who they are, they know what they're about, they know what the purpose of life is and what they're for, has a stability of soul, there's a gravity to them because they fear the Lord, and the gravity of God gives them gravity, and then a readiness to act, not a passivity, not an abdication, or even a reactivity, snapping out, but a real deliberate, like I am poised, locked, and ready to take good, wise, and faithful action based on what I'm seeing. That's sober-mindedness, and that's the kind of leaders we need.
Alrighty. Well, I really do appreciate that, and I thank you for earlier adding some context to how it's not just your responsibility, but it is a fact that you will be in roles of leadership, and that you can either abdicate from or you can live up to. So, well, Pastor Dr. Joe Rigney, thank you very much for coming onto the Redacted Culture Cast and spending some time with us to talk about your book. It is one that I think has become very quickly one of my favorites. So I appreciate that. Thank you for coming out. And then hopefully we'll have another conversation with you after the next
Love to
one,
do it.
because I really do appreciate this time where for years it seems like the solution to our problems only come on layers, and their layers are just distracted into an argument on which one takes priority. But I think we have another good place to start from. Alrighty. So without further ado, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Today's guest, Dr. Pastor Joe Rigney. And if you would like to support the show, you can head over to redactedllc.com and check out some of our upcoming events. On the 22nd of April, the 22nd of February, we'll be having a public land cleanup in Phoenix. So if you'd like to be a part of that, join the team. We'll talk to you there. Otherwise, go forth and conquer.